What you're looking at here is an image from some astronomy software that I have. This red line right here is the ecliptic. That's an imaginary line that astronomers use, and it marks the path of the constellations of the zodiac. Obviously we have sun and moon here along the ecliptic in this illustration. Here's an illustration of the, again, familiar constellations, how they follow the ecliptic right here. Now what we have here, and again this is part of a lecture I do in Revelation 12, is the constellation Virgo, the Virgin. If you go back and read Revelation 12, it is very obviously about the virgin birth, the birth of Jesus, the Messiah. But the signs and symbols that are used in Revelation 12 are well-known astronomical symbols. The constellation Virgo is the only one that represents a woman. For 20 days, Virgo is clothed with the sun. That's an astronomical term that means the sun appears in the constellation. That language comes from Revelation 12. But in Revelation 12, we not only have the sun clothing the woman, or inside the woman, we have the moon at her feet. The important note here is that for 20 days, Virgo gets clothed with the sun. But the exact day when the moon is under her feet can occur only during an 80-minute window within that span of days. So both of these signs, the sun in Virgo and the moon at her feet, are important. And the sun is about midway in her midsection. Again, there's symbology there as far as a pregnancy. If you actually looked up the constellation Virgo in Norton's star atlas, and I'm sure other atlases, there would be 12 visible stars around her head. Again, this is all well-known ancient world symbology and astronomical, observable astronomy. If we look at the alignment of constellations, here's Virgo in the middle. I've taken the pictures out and just done the line drawings. Sun in the midst of Virgo, moon at her feet right here. Above Virgo's head is Leo, of course the lion symbology, the Lion of Judah. Within Jupiter, at the very same time that Virgo is clothed with the sun and the moon is at her feet, we have a conjunction between Regulus and Jupiter. Jupiter is known as the king star in ancient astronomy. It's because it's the biggest one. Regulus, of course, if you know Latin, you know that's terminology for the king. That is the king star. So we have the king planet, Jupiter, and the king star, Regulus, in conjunction. If you did any reading on like out of Martin's book or some other sources, this is very important symbology for a royal birth. It's known all through the ancient world. It just so happens that in this situation we have this simultaneous conjunction in the constellation Leo, again, which was in Jewish astronomy and Jewish astrology, and that was practiced for many centuries. We have the sign of a royal birth in the tribe of Judah, which is obviously messianic. And by the way, the whole thing about Jewish astrology, there have been a number of zodiac mosaics uncovered in Jewish synagogues in Palestine in the early centuries, the early church. There are whole dissertations written on this subject. Jewish and Christian attitudes toward the stars. There is an orthodox astronomy, an orthodox astrology, if you want to call it that. In the ancient world, astronomy and astrology are pretty blurred. And there are obvious non-orthodox or pagan systems as well. Below here, below the woman, okay, we have the sun in Virgo and the Virgin, moon at her feet. In modern zodiac, we have here Scorpio and then Libra, the scales. In the ancient world, these were combined. If you can conceive of this in your imagination, here's the tail of Scorpio, and then Libra was thought to be the claws that were joined right here. So this entire set of what are now two constellations were in the ancient world viewed as one, and it was known as the dragon. Again, that's right out of Revelation 12. Here's a superimposed picture over it. Now we have Scorpio and Libra, the scales, but in the ancient times this was one known as the dragon. There's another candidate for the dragon in Revelation 12 on the other side of the ecliptic. We have Hydra right here, but I tend to think that what John is describing is the ancient dragon constellation right here, Scorpio and Libra combined in today's terminology. Now, the important thing about this is that in Revelation 12, all of these signs can occur, again, in only an 80-minute window of each other. So to account for all the signs in Revelation 12 during not just one calendar year, but during a whole series of astronomical periods and ages, you have a very small window of time where all of these things can be present at the same time, where everything is accounted for. The birth of the child in Revelation 12, as I have a note up here, again, whom John identified with Jesus, occurring while the sun was clothing the woman, the king star, king planet in Leo, again, Jupiter, or not Jupiter, but the sign for the tribe of Judah. All of these things did occur in a year that fits well for Jesus' birth, and that is 3 BC. What I've just laid out for you is common knowledge in many planetaria throughout the country and in Europe, that this is one of the candidates for the birth of Christ. It's the only birth year that accounts for all of these symbols. So if you read in the academic literature about candidates for the birth of Christ, they range anywhere from 2 BC to 6 BC. But none of the scholarly literature that I've seen considers Revelation 12, and I think that's the missing element. The real sort of interesting thing about 3 BCs is since this concatenation of signs can only occur in an 80-minute window, we know exactly the date of the birth of the Messiah in 3 BC, and that date is September 11th, which, again, this kind of spooks people. September 11th, 3 BC is the only time, the only day, for many, many, many centuries, that you could have all of these signs come together. This date as well, if you notice this note, also corresponded at the time to Rosh Hashanah, Tishri 1, New Year's Day for the Jews, which was also the Day of Trumpets. This was the day that many of the ancient kings and rulers of Judah reckoned as their inauguration day of rule. That procedure was followed consistently in the time of Solomon, Jeremiah, and Ezra. This is the day that would have marked the birth of the King of the Jews. And so we have an alignment with the Jewish tradition, the Jewish calendar, all the astronomical imagery in Revelation 12. September 11th, 3 BC can also accommodate all of the circumstances associated with the death of Herod and all these historical questions that come up when people are trying to come up with a date for the birth of Christ. And again, you won't find this in a lot of the scholarly literature because they aren't considering Revelation 12. They're using Matthew 2 with the wandering star, and what that was, it was the conjunction of Jupiter and Regulus. Jupiter has retrograde motion. It appears to move in the sky. Again, this is all well known in the literature. That much they do cover, but the missing link here is the Revelation 12, taking that seriously as astral prophecy.
Like most Christians, I'd love to know the date of the birth of Christ. I'd love to know exactly when Jesus was born. But let's talk about what we know historically. Clement of Alexandria, a bishop of the early church, lived 150 to 215 AD, mentions that by his time, 200 AD, some Christian groups had tried to pin down the birth of Christ. Interesting. Here we are, less than 200 years after the birth of Christ, and the various groups that he mentioned none of them even mentioned December as the date of the birth of Christ. My personal belief was that Christ would have been born sometime in September, and there's a number of reasons that I believe this. One is, if you look at Luke chapter 1, verse 5, it says this: "In the time of Herod the king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah." Now, without going into a lot of information about priests, they served twice a year. And in 4 BC, and I believe Christ was born in 3 BC, and again, Ernest Martin has a book called The Star That Astonished the World that has a lot of very technical information about this that I think he's probably right on. But in 4 BC, the course of Abijah served the last week of May, which meant that Zechariah would have gone home and his wife Elizabeth would have been impregnated in June. 9 months after, or 6 months after June is December. And it was in the 6th month of John the Baptist's conception, if you will, after his conception, that Mary was impregnated. So that would mean that Christ would have been, or Mary would have been impregnated in December and then born in September. Also, remember the record of the shepherds in the fields by night. Well, I've been to Israel a number of times, and it snows many times in December, and it's cold in December outside of Bethlehem in the hills of Judea. It is cold. So the chances are that the shepherds aren't just going to be in the fields at night. They would have been in the sheepfold. It was traditional that the shepherds were in the fields at night after the harvest. The harvest would have all been completed by August, but then before the cold months settled in, and then at that point they'd bring them inside into a sheepfold. So the fact that the shepherds were out in the fields by night points to September